This title promises the viewer a precise turning point. The moment a young mother's understanding of her own marriage was dismantled by a single question from a stranger in a medical office. The audience who clicks is a woman between 25 and 55, who either lived inside a high-control religious community or is drawn to the forbidden world of those who did. She clicks because she senses the asymmetry. A doctor could see in minutes what this woman couldn't see in years. The curiosity gap is the question itself. What did he ask? And the title withholds it completely. The strongest hook direction is another person's voice, because the title's gravitational center is the doctor's words. The viewer clicked to hear them. The CTA belongs after the marriage backstory compression and before the return to the examination room, a natural breath between the setup and the descent. He looked at me over the top of his clipboard and said, "Can I ask you something about your husband?" And the room, that small fluorescent room with the paper crinkling under my legs and the antiseptic smell that burned the inside of my nose, went so quiet I could hear the printer running in the hallway. My baby was asleep against my chest. I was 20 years old. No, I had just turned 21, because I remember the birthday had passed without anyone marking it, which was normal where I came from. I didn't know yet that the next 30 seconds would take apart everything I believed about my marriage. I just sat there, holding my daughter. I said, "Yes, sir." Before I tell you what he asked me, let me tell you who I am. My name is Emma, and this is Emma the Amish soul. I share these stories because I carried them alone for a long time, and carrying alone is what almost broke me. If these stories find you at a time when you need them, if hearing someone say the quiet thing out loud matters to you, I'd be grateful if you subscribed and stayed. You can also support this channel through super thanks or membership if that's something you choose, and I don't take that lightly. Let me ask you something before I go on. Was there ever a moment when a stranger saw something about your life that the people closest to you couldn't? Tell me in the comments. Now let me take you back to how I ended up in that room. I need to tell you how I got there, because I didn't walk into that doctor's office looking for what I found. My daughter had a fever, 102, which I know now is not remarkable for a 7-month-old, but which I knew nothing about then. My husband was at a livestock auction 2 counties over. His mother told me to put a cool cloth on the baby's head and wait, said her own children had run fevers higher than that and none of them died from it. She said it the way she said most things, with her mouth set and her hands already moving on to the next task, as if my worry was just another mess she had to step around. But something in me would not settle. I cannot explain it better than that. A thread pulled tight in my chest that would not go slack. I called an English driver from the phone shanty at the end of our lane. I had the doctor's number written on a piece of paper I'd torn from a feed store receipt weeks earlier, after a woman at the bulk store mentioned a pediatrician in town who was patient with plain families. I had kept that scrap of paper folded inside the baby's sock drawer like something stolen. The driver's name was Linda. She came in a tan minivan that smelled like vanilla air freshener, and I sat in the back because I did not know if I was supposed to sit in the front. I did not know how to buckle the car seat. Linda showed me without saying anything about it, and I have thought about that kindness more times than she will ever know. I held the diaper bag on my lap, packed wrong, I'm sure, because no one had ever shown me what to bring. The office was in a strip mall between a laundromat and a place that sold cell phones. I remember the parking lot because it was January, and the asphalt had that particular wet, cold shine, and I was wearing my black bonnet and my cape dress, and my shoes were not made for pavement like that. The waiting room had plastic chairs and a television mounted to the wall, playing cartoons with the sound off. I had never been in a medical office without my mother-in-law or my husband beside me. I filled out the forms with a pen that had a plastic flower taped to the top of it, and there were questions I could not answer. Our insurance, our income, medications I was taking. I left those lines blank. The receptionist looked at the blank lines, and then she looked at me, and then she smiled and said it was fine. I should tell you about my wedding before I tell you about that exam room, because you cannot understand what the doctor saw if you don't understand where I came from. I married Eli when I was 18. He was 23, no, 22. I always add a year. We had courted for 7 months, mostly through Sunday singings and a few buggy rides after dark. And I want to be clear that I chose him. Nobody forced my hand. He was gentle with the horses. He built things, birdhouses, shelving, a cradle for a cousin's baby, and his hands moved with a kind of patient certainty that made me feel like the world had an order to it. I sewed my wedding dress myself, a deep blue fabric my mother picked from the dry goods store in Intercourse. The whole church came. We ate roast chicken and filling and creamed celery, and the singing lasted until my throat was raw. The night before the wedding, my mother sat on the edge of my bed. She had come to talk to me about marriage. I know this because she said so. She said, "I need to talk to you about what happens after." And then she was quiet for a long time. I could hear the kerosene lamp hissing on the dresser. She smelled like bread dough and the lavender she kept in the closet. And she looked at her hands the way you look at something you're trying to read in bad light. What she finally said was this: "It is your duty, and it will get easier." 7 words. She touched my knee, and then she stood up, and then she left. I won't tell you what happened that night after the wedding. I have tried to find a way to speak about it that doesn't make me feel like I am back in that room, with the quilt pulled up and the lamp blown out, and I have not found that way yet. So I will say only this: nothing I had ever been told prepared me for it. Not one word. The pregnancy came fast, within 2 months. I did not fully understand how my body worked, which I know sounds impossible, but I need you to hear me when I say that I had never seen a diagram. I had never been given a book. I had never heard the correct names for parts of my own body. What I knew from animals on the farm, and what I assumed was that the pain was natural, that it was the price of being a wife, the way hard labor was the price of being a man. I mentioned it once to my cousin Sarah, I will call her Sarah, while we were canning peaches in her kitchen. I said something about how it hurt and didn't seem to be getting better. She set down the jar she was holding and looked at the wall above my head and said, "You get used to it." Her voice was flat the way a field is flat after it's been mowed. I did not ask again. During the pregnancy, I crocheted a small blanket for the baby. White yarn, cheap, from the bulk store. It pilled almost immediately, but I kept working on it because the repetition calmed something in me that nothing else could reach. I brought that blanket to the doctor's office. It was folded on my lap under the diaper bag, and when I shifted in the plastic chair, I could feel the uneven stitches against my wrist. I tell you about this blanket because it matters later, though I didn't know that at the time. I just brought it because it smelled like her, like milk and the wood smoke that got into everything in our house, and because holding something she had touched made me feel less like I was betraying the family by being there at all. The doctor checked the baby first. He was an older man, gray at the temples, glasses, a calm that felt almost Amish in its stillness, if that makes sense. He held my daughter carefully. He looked in her ears, listened to her chest, pressed gently on her belly. He said the fever was likely a mild ear infection and wrote a prescription. I should have thanked him and left. That is what I planned to do. But he paused, the kind of pause that has weight to it, the kind where someone is deciding whether to say something. He looked at me. He said, "While you're here, would you like me to check on you as well? I noticed on your form that you haven't had a postpartum visit." I said yes. I said it before I understood what I was agreeing to, before I knew what a postpartum visit was, before I had any idea that a man I had known for 12 minutes was about to ask me a question that would open a door I could never close again. He asked me to sit on the exam table, and I did, and the paper crinkled under me the way it had when I first sat down. But this time the sound was louder because the room was quieter. My daughter was asleep in her car seat on the floor beside the table, and the blanket, that crocheted blanket with the uneven stitches, was tucked around her chin. The doctor washed his hands at the small sink in the corner. He dried them slowly. He said, "I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want you to know that there are no wrong answers and nothing you say leaves this room." I nodded. I did not know that doctors spoke like that. I did not know that a man could stand that close to me and ask permission before every single thing he did. He examined me gently, and I will not describe it in detail because that is not what this is for. But I will tell you that he was quiet for a long time during the examination. The kind of quiet that has a texture to it, like cloth stretched too tight. When he was finished, he pulled off his gloves and sat down on the rolling stool and looked at me, and his face had changed. Not dramatically, not with alarm. It was more like watching a window fog over. Something behind his expression had shifted, and he was working to keep his voice level. He said, "How long have you been experiencing pain?" And I said, "Since the beginning." He wrote something down. He did not look away from me when he asked the next question. And I remember that because where I came from, men did not look at you when they spoke about anything that mattered. They looked at the floor, or the wall, or their hands. The questions came one after another, each one careful, each one measured, each one landing somewhere inside me that had never been touched by language before. He asked if my husband was aware of the pain. I said yes. He asked what my husband did when he knew I was in pain. I opened my mouth, and I closed it. I opened it again. I said, "He finishes." The doctor wrote something down. He asked if I had ever said no. I did not understand the question at first, not because I didn't know the word, but because the word had never existed inside that context. No was for children refusing supper. No was for a horse that wouldn't take the bit. No was not a thing that wives said to husbands in the dark. It had never been presented to me as a door I was allowed to open. I told him this, not in those words, but in the words I had then, and he listened without writing, which was how I knew I had said something that mattered more than the other things. He asked me, and this is the question, the one the title of this story carries, he said. Does your husband know that what is happening is hurting you, or does he believe this is normal? And the room tilted, not physically. The fluorescent light didn't flicker. My daughter didn't stir. But something inside the architecture of my understanding shifted the way a house shifts on its foundation in a slow thaw, not collapsing, but settling into a new position from which it could never return. Because I realized, sitting on that paper in that strip mall office, with the cartoons still playing silently in the waiting room, that I had never considered the question. I had never separated those two possibilities. He knows and believes it is normal. Those had been the same thing inside my marriage. The doctor had just put a hairline crack between them, and the crack was everything. I held the burp rag from the diaper bag. No, the blanket, the crocheted one. I had pulled it from the car seat and pressed it between my hands while he spoke, and the stitches bit into my palms, and I did not loosen my grip. There was a sound in my ears like water moving through a pipe somewhere deep in the building. My hands went cold. The doctor kept talking, but his voice had become the gentlest thing I had ever heard from a man. Quieter than Eli's voice in the dark. Quieter than my father's voice during evening prayer. And what he said next was a word. A single clinical term. He said it the way you'd say the name of a town you were giving someone directions to. Plainly, without weight, as if it were simply a place on a map. I had never heard the word before. I will not repeat it here, because when I heard it in that room, it was like hearing a bell for the first time, and realizing that the ringing you'd been hearing your whole life was not inside your own head. It was a word that meant other women had this. It was a word that meant there was a medical literature, a body of knowledge, a world of people who studied this, and named it, and treated it. It meant what had been happening to me was not between me and God. It was not my failure as a wife. It was a wound. And wounds have names. I drove home in Linda's tan minivan. She did not ask me anything. The baby slept, and the fields passed, and the sky was the color of a week-old bruise, that greenish-gray that January skies in Lancaster County carry like a weight. I sat in the back seat with my hands folded around that blanket, and I looked at my daughter's face, and I thought about Eli. He was not a bad man. I need you to hear that. He built the shelf above her crib with his own hands. He sang to her in the mornings, not from the Ausbund, just nonsense songs, little melodies he made up while he heated water for the oats. He had never been told either. No one sat him on the edge of a bed the night before the wedding and said, "This is what she will feel. This is what you must ask. This is what her silence means." The system that failed me had failed him too, and I sat in that minivan knowing both things at once, that he had hurt me, and that he had been given no tools not to. I did not know which grief was heavier. I still don't. I thought about Sarah. I thought about her standing in her kitchen with the peach juice on her wrists, telling me I would get used to it. And I understood then that Sarah had never been given the word either, that she was still inside the house of her own marriage, still believing the pain was the price, still telling the next woman in line that this was simply what it cost to be a wife. The silence protected itself. That is what I understood in the back of that minivan. It moved from mother to daughter like a quilt pattern, each generation stitching the same shape without ever asking what the shape was for. It wasn't cruelty. It was a system so old and so quiet that the women inside it mistook it for God's design, and the men inside it mistook it for their right. And nobody had ever stopped long enough to say the word that would break the pattern open. If you have ever sat on a paper-covered table in a room that smelled like alcohol swabs and heard a stranger ask a question about your life that no one who loved you ever thought to ask, I see you. If you have ever heard a word for the first time and felt your whole life reorganize around it like water finding a new path down a hill, I see you. If you have ever held your baby and thought, I want her to have the word I was never given. I want her to know the name of the door before someone closes it. I see you. And if you are still in the house, still folding the laundry, still telling yourself this is just how it is, and you are watching this on a phone you keep in the bottom of a drawer, I see you most of all. You are not broken. You were kept from knowing. The silence was never yours to carry. And knowing, even now, even this late, even just this much, knowing is where it begins.